Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. Planes, trains and automobiles. A controversial third runway at Heathrow gets the green light. Train timetables in chaos. And the biggest petrol price increase in 18 years. The government faces a transport triple whammy. After the historic referendum in favour of legalising abortion in the Republic of Ireland, we'll speak to Stella Creasy, the Labour MP, calling for a similar change in Northern Ireland. Almost half of councils in England are making cuts to sexual health services, with clinics closing or reducing their hours. What will be the impact on the nation's health? This advert upset the Home Secretary and elements of the popular press. Is the cosmetics company Lush exposing police wrongdoing or smearing the public servants who keep us safe? All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today, our own pair of Lushes. The Times columnist David Aronovich and the Conservative MP Nadine Dorries. Not knowingly undersold, well, I've said it now. First of all today, governments have been talking about it for decades, but a third runway at Heathrow came one step closer this morning, as the Economic Subcommittee, chaired by Theresa May, is expected to back the plans before sending them to full cabinet. If approved, MPs would be asked to vote on the issue in the coming weeks. Nadine, how will you be voting?
Sorry, I was actually thinking about something else then. Sorry.
Well, you're right. You're allowed to pause of silence and you're allowed to reflect.
But how would that's an abstention?
Heathrow, I am voting against the third runway at Heathrow for a very specific reason. I thought you were coming to this one next. Very specific reason, and that is because my constituency butts onto Luton Airport. In fact, many of the workers at Luton Airport live in my constituency and are my constituents. And we have room for another runway at Luton.
Right.
And so actually, and we are just 48 miles outside of London. I think if we are looking for a new runway to service London and to service the UK, Luton is the place it should be going. But
your answer, of course, to the question about Heathrow and third runway is you'll be voting against it. And will you be expecting the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, who said that if it was ever given the green light by the government, he would lie down in front of the bulldozers? Do you expect him to still do that, metaphorically, if not literally, and resign from the government?
Joe, Boris says many things which are often controversial and often said to bring a focus attention on the issue. You would have to ask Boris whether he was going to lie down in front of a bulldozer or not me. However, I think he would very much stick to his guns, that he will not. I would imagine he will also vote as he has said he was going to vote in the past. Otherwise, his position would be very difficult.
Would you like him to lie down in front of a bulldozer?
I wouldn't like to see anybody lie down in front of a bulldozer.
Right, but he'd be voting against his own government.
That is a difficult situation in terms of collective responsibility, but given his strongly held position in the past, I think that maybe that's what he's going to have to do.
He's not going to be the only one in that difficult position, because Labour have said that they are in favour of expansion, airport expansion in the south east, but it has to meet a certain number of tests, first of all, including environmental tests. And the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, has said he will oppose a third runway at Heathrow come what may.
Yeah, I mean, 3 years' time we can celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Roskill Commission report, which recommended airport expansion in the south east. Took the Tory government then out of to Maplin, if you remember, their first idea of the Boris Island off on the Essex coast, and so on. And we have been playing with this for the best part of half a century, and we can't make a decision. It's nearly as old as I am, this decision. Every time it's looked at by any reasonably large group of people and experts, etc., they come to the conclusion that the best option, if you want to expand capacity, is to have the third runway at Heathrow.
But
and that will happen every single time they look at it.
But do you think it will happen now? I mean, if the government now is giving it the green light to be put to MPs in a parliamentary vote, do you think it will happen?
No, I don't think anything can happen in this country.
Right, full
stop. But isn't it the case, though, David,
more or less. I'm amazed Crossrail's gone ahead.
Well, it has, and it's about to be completed.
And I'm amazed High Speed 2, HS2 is going ahead and so on. But the airport thing, I think it's impossibly nixed now.
Nadine, what were you going to say?
But I just think there are so many other options that have not been explored fully. That I have no idea why the focus is relentlessly on Heathrow when there is so much opposition, so many lives are affected by it. There are so many people opposed to this for so many good reasons. Why aren't the other options? Luton hasn't even been considered properly. We have the land, we have the transport links, we have the M1 straight into London. It hasn't even properly been investigated or considered.
I think they've looked,
and neither is the Boris Island.
I think they've looked at pretty much all of them, actually.
No, they've scantily looked at them.
No, I think they really have, over time, looked at all of them. And each time they do, they come up with that. We have an enormous, great airport. We decided to put it at Heathrow and so on. So if it's a hub airport you want, and that's the important question, it's an expanded hub airport, it has to be there.
Right, well, let's move on. To coin a phrase. Heathrow isn't the only headache for the Transport Secretary. He spent yesterday afternoon and evening listening to MPs' anger boil over, in some cases, over the timetable chaos on the railways. Let's have a listen to some of those angry exchanges in the Commons yesterday.
But ultimately, this solution can only be delivered by the rail industry. These problems can only be fixed by Network Rail and the train operators methodically working through the timetable and replanning train paths and driver resourcing to deliver a more reliable service.
The underlying issues behind these timetable changes and how they have gone wrong actually land squarely with his department. Does he accept that his unwillingness to accept any responsibility for this actually undermines efforts for him to put it right?
May I suggest to him, ask him, if he is aware that the rail service to East Grinstead, which he has always taken an interest in, has finally fallen over completely, that trains from Haywards Heath, Wivelsfield and Burgess Hill are shorter and more overcrowded, that people's private lives are being destroyed, and this whole thing is an absolute disaster and must be put right.
Can I just say, frankly, to the Secretary of State, passengers have lost faith in him. Isn't it about time he step aside and allow someone else to do the job who can fix this problem?
He's been in situ for 2 years now. Aren't my constituents entitled to think that this is just an utterly pointless Transport Secretary? Because nothing ever changes under his watch.
How much more evidence do we need that the senior management in Network Rail and GTR is incompetent, incapable and inept? And how long can they go on?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we need to establish who is directly responsible for the decision-makings that have been got wrong here, and establish the truth through the Glaister review, and then take appropriate action, and we will.
Well, that was some mauling in the House of Commons, and a lot of it from his own side. But joining me now is the Shadow Transport Minister, Labour's Rachel Maskell. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Do you think the Secretary of State for Transport should go?
Absolutely. I mean, unprecedented yesterday when we spent 90 minutes hearing from right across the country the chaos unleashed on our railways, and really devastating stories of young people not being able to get to college to take their exams, people being delayed at work and therefore not being able to fulfil childcare. I mean, it's devastating home life, jobs, and therefore the Secretary of State is fully responsible. He's head of the Department of Transport.
Yes.
He admitted yesterday he knew that these troubles were coming and therefore he's got to take responsibility.
Do you accept it's a complicated situation?
Well, it's complicated because the railways are so fragmented, and therefore we know that decisions were made in one part of the network, not communicated to another part of the network. But it doesn't have to be that way, and that's why we're saying bringing the rail together under a public ownership model will make such a difference in removing those barriers which currently exist.
So why would removing Chris Grayling sort out the chaos you've described?
Well, it's not just Chris Grayling, it's the whole scheme now, and certainly we've heard calls to move rail and take these franchises off these companies which have also failed passengers.
So why would removing him sort out the problem?
Well, Chris Grayling is in charge, and apart from he's not in charge because he hasn't taken responsibility and he hasn't taken the action to prevent what was actually happened yesterday, particularly with an emergency timetable which has also failed passengers right across the country.
He has failed, hasn't he, Chris Grayling?
No. Do you know, I was just saying to Rachel outside, actually, I've been in Parliament quite a while now, and we've been having one crisis after another. It was first Capital Connect. It's been one train operator after another over a long period of time. In fact, between the 2005 and 2010 government, when Labour were in power, we had similar debates on similar. It's ongoing.
So has privatisation failed when it comes to the railways?
Well, I hope we're getting to the point now where where we're actually upgrading hugely with longer carriages, longer platforms in my constituency.
And there's still chaos.
Still chaos, but I hope we're getting to the point now. Well, this has to be. We have to hit the buffers on this. This has to be the end of the line.
Oh my goodness! How many more?
Exactly. There were. I can give you any number from yesterday's debate. We have to now move forward quickly. I hope. Chris has just in answer to your point that you just made, Rachel. Chris has said yesterday there is going to be an assessment into what happened with the timetabling, and there is going to be a full inquiry. I hope after that we will see changes in management in the individual franchises that will prevent this happening. And also another point,
it's about accountability, Nadine Dorries. Who is ultimately responsible?
The train operating companies. You know, this excuse.
So the
we
Secretary
need more
of State
drivers.
and the head of the Department of Transport, who is directly responsible, takes no accountability for this at all.
Well, he takes accountability. I think he stood up in the House of Commons yesterday and did take accountability by saying there will be an assessment and there will be a full inquiry. But this excuse that we are constantly being given, we need more drivers, we need more training, this is down to the individual operating companies who have been using that excuse now for a number of years.
But the problem is that the system is failing the public. And you mentioned that this has been an ongoing saga. It has been an ongoing saga since the railways were put into private ownership. In fact, British Rail was operating at its best when... Well, that's why we are going to say we're going to get rid of these franchises, because when you have fragmentation, we get the situations which have occurred when one part of the railway system is under different management to another part, and therefore they're not coordinated and working together. And it's absolutely vital that we have that connectivity across our rail system.
Brain surgery, is it?
Well, that's why
it really isn't.
It's
about getting trains going from A to B through certain stations at certain times
in the day.
And that's why
our public system will work.
That complicated,
Rachel.
Our public system will work because it is about taking away those barriers, having one conversation as opposed to multiple conversations across the railway,
but
which
they never worked before, Rachel. Which is
we're not moving back to the past. We're moving forward to a new model of rail, which is built on the best across Europe and the best across the world, in fact. So we have spent our time working with academics, working with rail operators to get the best system for the future, and that's where we're moving to.
Why not try something new when, as you have said, successive governments have failed, commuters have been failed, and listening to that debate yesterday, even MPs in your own party have had enough.
Well, we've had enough of the management of the individual train operating companies, but there has been progress. We've seen that it's at London Bridge and at Blackfriars, and in the improvement and the upgrading of the trains. We're moving to driverless trains. We've seen a massive upgrading in the service, and I think we're at the point of actually reaping the rewards of that whole investment that's gone into the entire train network.
All right. Let me just stop you there briefly, because we're going to talk to our political correspondent, Norman Smith. I don't know if you were listening to some of the debate going on here in the studio, but we also showed some of the exchanges, Norman, from yesterday in the House of Commons, where Chris Grayling, the Secretary for Transport, really did get something of a morning from many people on his own side. And the rail chaos united all the northern newspapers. We can show you now some of the headlines who were reporting on that chaos and demanding, there's the Manchester Evening News, and demanding that something is done. And the Yorkshire Post, enough is enough, Mrs May, act now to end the North's rail crisis. How much trouble is Chris Grayling in, Norman?
I think he's in a lot of trouble. I mean, what saves him at the moment is Downing Street basically continuing to express confidence in his handling of the situation. But what is striking, I think, is the level of disquiet amongst Tory MPs and very senior Tory MPs, figures like Sir Michael Fallon and so on. And I think what is compounding their disquiet is there does not seem to be any obvious end in sight to the sort of horror stories many of their constituents are having to suffer. I mean, there are suggestions the sort of timetable chaos could rumble on into July. And quite apart from the misery which many passengers are having to endure, there's the question of the economic impact, a situation where, you know, some of the main commuter lines into London just aren't operating properly. I think, you know, the clock is ticking for Chris Grayling, and if it does drag on, then I begin to wonder whether Downing Street's support for him will survive. And it was striking watching him going into Cabinet this morning. I thought he looked pretty crestfallen and battered, as maybe it's not surprising, and perhaps unfortunately for him, when he got to the door at number 10, you know, there's sort of a long, protracted delay before it opened, which almost seemed a metaphor, not just for the railways, but perhaps for his own future.
Let's move on to another big transport issue that has, as my other guest David been saying, going on for about 50 years or so, which is Heathrow. The green light being given for that third runway.
Interesting, because, as we know, successive prime ministers have basically dodged it just because it's far too difficult, and yet Mrs May has decided to go for it when she's already sort of involved in a epic battle with Parliament over Brexit, when she knows there'll be, maybe up to 30 Tory MPs who defy her, when she knows her Foreign Secretary will speak out against it. And that, I think, reflects the conviction in Number 10 that they've got the numbers to win it. Primarily because of support among opposition MPs, because Mrs May can probably count on the support of the SNP, the DUP, and I would think whatever Jeremy Corbyn eventually decides to do, and I should say Labour front benches have been keeping their head well down this morning on the issue, there is still quite a solid phalanx of Labour MPs who will back Heathrow come what may. So on the back of that, I think the view in Downing Street is that they can win this. And if they do, I suspect that will be presented by Team May as evidence that she is not, you know, the weak, hopeless leader who can't achieve anything, because here she is, she's done something which successive prime ministers have run away from.
Norman Smith, thank you very much. Well, Rachel, listening to that, what is the Labour leadership's policy on Heathrow and the third runway?
Well, our policy has been consistent straight from the start. We've said there are 4 tests that we'll be looking at, and we'll be examining today's statement to see if it's met those tests around economic reach, around the environmental impact that Heathrow will actually have. And of course, the Transport Select Committee then set 25 tests in their report scrutinising the process. So it is really important that we ensure that we do reach those carbon standards, which obviously we know the government are failing on so many levels.
But if those tests are met, then the Labour Party and the Labour leadership will back a third runway at Heathrow.
Well, we've got to see what the Transport Secretary comes forward with
today.
But
if your tests are met, I presume that's what they're there for.
That's been the position, is to see whether or not that is possible.
Why has John McDonnell, your shadow chancellor, the man who wants to run the economy, already decided that he won't be backing Heathrow expansion or a third runway? He says he will always oppose it.
Well, we've got to look. I mean, the expansion is going to massively remove so much housing from his constituency, but also there's big issues around the air quality in his constituency and the noise pollution. And that's why our tests will really fundamentally help formulate what will happen.
But should John McDonnell then fall into line if those tests are met, despite the way you've just outlined the problems in his constituency?
We're waiting to see exactly what the Secretary of State has got to say today, because we want to scrutinise whether or not the standards have been reached. To date, we haven't seen the evidence that that will be forthcoming, and it certainly wasn't at the last stage. So we really want to see that it's not just about air pollution from air traffic, but also the surface transportation as well.
On Chris Grayling, just to go back to something that Norman Smith said, he's under a lot of pressure, and Heathrow, to some extent, will add to that too. Do you think he will survive?
This sounds absolutely appalling, but I really don't care. I mean, we actually have a rail regulator who is supposed to kind of adjudicate. It's a little bit like holding the Chancellor of the Exchequer responsible for the Visa card problem the other day. This is really about an opportunity to bash a minister who's not very good and, you know, is a rather kind of boring bank manager kind of type, and also on the wrong side for a lot of people of the Brexit debate and so on. I think this probably, if they do sort out the problems within the next few weeks, then he'll probably survive. If not, I'm not really quite sure what sacking him will achieve, because all you get is then as a Transport Secretary has exactly the same problem.
All right, we'll leave it there. Rachel Maskell, thank you. Now, at the weekend, voters in the Republic of Ireland voted to legalise abortion there, but it is still illegal in most circumstances in Northern Ireland. In the next hour, though, MPs here in Westminster will debate whether to change the law there. The debate was secured by the Labour MP, Stella Creasy.
Because the people of Northern Ireland cannot be held to hostage to the ups and downs of the Brexit negotiations, the deals done in a hung parliament, or the stall in talks in Stormont. By repealing OPA, we as the UK Parliament can show women across the UK we trust them all with their own healthcare, wherever they live. I ask members to stand up with me and join in saying this is the 21st century.
Order. I have listened carefully to the application from the honourable member. I am satisfied that the matter is proper to be raised under, and indeed discussed, under Standing Order number 24. Has the honourable member the leave of the House? Clearly, the honourable member has obtained the leave of the House. I can advise colleagues that the debate will be held tomorrow.
Well, we can speak now to Stella Creasy, who you saw there in that clip, who's in Central Lobby. But just before I ask Stella a question, Nadine Dorries, what do you make there of the support from your own side, from many leading female Tory MPs for at least a debate to change the law in Northern Ireland?
Well, absolutely, and I think it's time. You know, what happened in Southern Ireland recently has kind of got the momentum behind it. I also think that, I don't know what Stella thinks of this, but this morning I did a number of interviews, and the only thing that's concerning me at the moment is I'd like to hear the voice of the women in Northern Ireland, and we're not hearing that. I don't know whether it's because the press aren't reporting it, or they're just not speaking up, but we're not actually hearing what the women in Northern Ireland think about this and what they want. But, you know, I think it is time for the law to change. The 67 Act that we have in this country is way out of date. That needs reforming, and I wouldn't want to see Northern Ireland adopt that crock of nonsense, because it just doesn't apply. I don't think we should have 2 doctors' signatures up until 12 weeks. There are lots that need to be changed. And I also think there should be gay marriage in Northern Ireland, because it's everywhere else. There's a lot to be discussed. But of course, it isn't our decision. We're just going to debate it. It's the decision of what should be the devolved government over Northern Ireland.
Right, so you think it should be a decision for the devolved Northern Ireland Assembly, even though, of course, it's suspended?
Very difficult. It's a very divisive issue and a very, very difficult time, because the talks have broken down.
Sure.
We're going to move again towards direct rule, I think. And if we do move towards direct rule, then it is the opportunity to come forward and to make this happen.
All right, let's go to Stella Creasy, who's there in Central Lobby. I don't know if you could hear what Nadine was saying there. Is it right to impose a reform or a change in the law on abortion on Northern Ireland?
No, and that's exactly not what I and the cross-party group of MPs supporting this are talking about doing. We are talking about repealing a piece of UK-wide legislation, and actually I know that the DUP MPs here in Parliament understand that and get that. This is a piece of legislation that's 150 years old, affects women not just in Northern Ireland but England and Wales, and until we repeal it, the possibility of a conversation about what kind of laws on abortion Northern Irish people would like can't really take place, because their law is underpinned by it.
Right, but as a result of that, Stella, you're right in saying, isn't it, that Northern Ireland relies on that law to a great degree in order to have the strict abortion laws they have.
Yes, so by repealing it, absolutely, we will create a gap. And it's right that in that gap, whether it's the civil servants or the Assembly if it's reconstituted, they will then formulate the abortion laws that make sense for Northern Ireland.
Right.
But they can do that from a medical rather than a criminal perspective, and that's what would change. It would also make an impact on my constituents and Nadine's constituents in England and Wales too, where I completely agree with Nadine, the 67 Act is out of date. Frankly, the idea that this is the one healthcare choice that you can't make for yourself doesn't make sense to me in the 21st century. And that's the same for women in my constituency as it is for Belfast as well.
Right. I mean,
we do have to be incredibly careful about this. I'm sure Stella knows, but my particular issue is abortion post 20 weeks. I don't agree that for social conditions it should happen post 20 weeks because of the possible sentience of the fetus. But, you know, up to 12 weeks, it should be much easier for women to obtain abortion. In an ideal world, all abortions would take place under 12 weeks. And so I think we need to liberalise our law here to make that much easier for women. And the same in Northern Ireland. But Northern Ireland, you know, I do know in the Southern Ireland recently in the referendum, the kind of arguments that Stella's talking about, the kind of human rights issue. I know that the Yes campaigners had to ask people to tone that down because that was actually working against the campaign. You know, in Ireland, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland are very different. They're very proud and very independent people in both parts of the country. I'm not sure that we are doing them any favours if it's even implied that we are trying to impose our will. I know Stella says we're not, but if we are trying to impose as Westminster politicians our will on their law. But Stella, I'm with you in repealing that Act. It is 1865, I think, the Offences Against the Person Act. I'm with you for repealing that. But we need to be careful as to what goes into place.
Do you understand that, Stella?
Well, let me reassure Nadine then, because I have seen some briefing from the, I don't call them pro-life, they're anti-choice organisations, suggesting that somehow repealing this 1861 piece of legislation would lead to abortion up to birth. There is an act in this country, a separate piece of legislation called the Infant Preservation Life Act 1929. Nobody's talking about changing that. That governs the situation after 24 weeks. What we are talking about is the situation before that and the conditions under which women are able to access abortion. Right now, it's categorised in this legislation alongside homicide, child stealing and blowing up buildings with gunpowder with the original intent to commit murder. That's how out of date this piece of legislation is. So let me reassure Nadine, nobody's looking at changing the time limits. Most of us recognise that the vast majority of abortions that take place in this country take place before 10 weeks. So those abortions at later dates are for particular reasons, for example, fatal fetal abnormality.
But that's
that isn't the debate. That isn't the debate we're
there.
having today. The debate we're having today is whether it is right to start from a criminal perspective for a woman's basic human right not to be forced to continue an unwanted pregnancy.
But Stella, Nadine has also raised the issue, though, of the time limit and bringing it to 20 weeks. What do you think about that?
So Nadine and I would be in a very different place on that, on the grounds of the medical guidance that we've seen. But I want to be clear, that is not up for grabs in this proposal. This proposal today is about a very specific 1861 piece of legislation that criminalises women whether they have an abortion at 12 weeks or 20 weeks.
Right. Would you like to see a referendum in Northern Ireland in the same way as in Ireland?
Well, I don't think there can be, because it's not a constitutional issue in Northern Ireland. So I don't think they can have a referendum in the same way that they had in Southern Ireland. But I would like to see it, regardless of the legal aspects of it. I would like to see it. But having said that, it is this piece of outdated, antiquated legislation. I think it just does need to go. And they need to decide in Northern Ireland what they replace it with and step up to the 21st century. And at the same time, I think they need to look at other... There needs to be parity across. If Arlene says that she wants no difference between Northern Ireland and the UK, then they need to look at introducing gay marriage into Northern Ireland as well.
What do you think in terms of Northern Ireland looking as if it's out of step now? Well, it is out of step on this particular area of social policy in the rest of the UK and Ireland.
Well, imagine that you're a person in Northern Ireland who's part of the majority. All polls show want a significant liberalisation of the abortion laws. There's not a poll that hasn't shown that. How do you effect that, given that the parties and the party situation and political situation in Northern Ireland is such that you tend to end up voting for parties that don't permit that? Now, Sinn Féin has changed its stance enormously. It used to be anti-abortion in line with the Catholic Church. The DUP is out of line, as it is on most subjects, with the majority of people in Northern Ireland. So how do you, in that circumstance, give effect? Now, I think actually a consultative referendum, if the Assembly were to agree it, or even actually if the British government were to suggest it and a significant proportion of politicians were to agree it, would actually be one way of doing it.
Right. Should Theresa May take a lead on this and actually push for something like this with her DUP partners to try and effect a change?
Well, I'm sure that behind the scenes that's what she's trying to do anyway, because the zeitgeist is here, it's happening. But, there is another whole angle to this, Stella, and Stella is an absolutely astute parliamentary campaigner. And, of course, as she knows, the relationship for the majority in the government rests on the relationship between the government and the DUP.
So
and
are
this
women in Northern Ireland being held hostage?
What Stella has done is she has thrown a hand grenade into number 10 in the form of this debate, which will test certainly the relationship between the Prime Minister and the DUP. I'm not going to say, even suggest what I think the Prime Minister should do.
Why not?
And I think
you're not usually shy in coming forward, Nadine.
But these are very divisive, difficult days. And I think the Prime Minister will know what she has to do. And I'm sure her and Arlene Foster have been talking. How long the DUP can hold out against progress and change and what is happening for women in these countries. In Ireland, I have no idea.
All right.
But
final word, Stella Creasy.
Look, Nadine says she wants to hear the voices of Northern Irish women. Well, their voices are saying that they don't want to be held hostage by Arlene Foster having a place at the table in Westminster for their basic human rights. So I think it's right that we do make progress on this here. I also want to say, look, having a referendum, what would the question be and who would put in place the legislation? Because we don't have an assembly. And if you're going to suggest having referendums on this, do you also want to see a referendum on the union? The people of Northern Ireland are very clear. They want change. They don't want referendums. They don't want an extension of the 67 Act. They do want us to repeal OPA, which would have to happen even if you did have a referendum, so that they can make their own laws. Let's get on and do it. We've waited 150 years for change in this legislation. We're now saying today to the government, don't make us wait more than 150 days to make this happen.
Stella Creasy, thank you very much. We did ask the DUP for an interview, but they didn't return our calls. Don't know why.
Now, Joe, can I just say there has to be something to replace OPA. It's not just a case of repealing it.
And this is the
and this is the issue. Yeah, something has to be put in its place.
All right. Now, last week, a row erupted after a job advert for a position in the office of the Labour MP Chuka Umunna appeared at Leeds University. Labour supporting Leeds student Kane Emerson tweeted his disappointment that the year-long advertised placement in London was unpaid. In a moment, we'll be speaking to Professor Tim Bale at Queen Mary University, London. But with us first is Amelia Horgan, Vice Chair of Young Labour London and a representative for NUS postgraduate students. Welcome to the programme. Tell us why the advert has upset you and others, Amelia.
Hiya. So it's a foundational belief of the Labour Party that people should be paid fairly for what they do and should be paid for what they do. Young people are shut out, young working class people are shut out of internships. It costs £1,000 a month for an unpaid internship, for your rent, for your for living in London. This shuts out young working class people. They can't afford to participate in these things, and this is not what the Labour Party should be doing.
Right, but Amelia, isn't it true that removing this option from university courses will lead to people from poorer and underrepresented backgrounds having less opportunity to work in Parliament?
So fundamentally, people should be paid for their work. This money should be found, whether that's from the party, whether that's from the universities. And let's not forget, there is a lot of money swishing around the universities at the top in vice-chancellors' salaries. That money should be found. People shouldn't be shut out. But we as a society, and especially we as a Labour Party, should pay people when they work for us.
Tim Bale, what do you say?
Well, I mean, I can understand the principle. However, if this does go through, if what Jeremy Corbyn is suggesting does go through, it basically means that our scheme at Queen Mary University of London and probably schemes at other universities will have to end. I mean, there is no financing available from universities to do this. We talk about money swishing around at universities. I'd love to see some of that, but I don't see it. So unless, say, IPSA or the Labour Party itself comes in and says, you know, we will help our MPs pay students, then I'm afraid these schemes will have to end. And that will be a pity because, for example, we had 29 finalists on this year on the scheme. It's 2 days a week when they're at QM. Obviously, they're all in London anyway. 16 of those 29 were from BAME backgrounds. And your point about getting, you know, a more diverse bunch of people into staffing at Westminster is a very good one.
So are you not shooting yourselves in the foot then, Amelia, by doing this? You're going to harm the very people whom you say you want to help and they won't benefit.
I think we need to pay people for our work. I think it points to just how rotten the system is. Students are paying fees for the chance to be exploited, for the small chance at the end they'll get a job. It really shows just how rotten things are, and I think these schemes shouldn't close, but students should be paid. Some MPs have paid them. It is possible. That money should be found and needs to be found because it is important that we have staff of MPs that reflect their communities, that include people of colour, that include women, that include working class people. That's really, really important.
Yes.
But we shouldn't exploit people. We shouldn't make people work for free.
Do you think they're being exploited? I mean, Tim Bale, in a way, when your students are taking part in this work experience unpaid internships, you're still getting paid, aren't you, as a course for the fees, even though you're not teaching them for that year? I mean, should that money be used?
That's an interesting point, but if we were to do that, we would end up paying some students for doing a particular module while we're not paying other students to do other modules. I think that would be, you know, unfair. There's an equity issue there as well. I mean, you know, it's very difficult for universities to say to some students, do this module and you'll get some money, do another module because that's something that you prefer to do and you won't get any money.
Where do you stand, David, on this?
As I was listening to Amelia and Tim, I was dotting around between them thinking, yeah, that's a good point, and that's a good point, and that's a good point, and so on. And it seems to me that there are kind of different elements there. There's the element of, you know, the kind of placement out of university, which has always happened to an extent and which people didn't expect to be paid for. There's the element of exploitation. I know that some of the sort of, you know, big private schools, for instance, have mega schemes whereby they launch their children and so on, and the kids of people in the sixth form into these schemes. So it's not as if they feel exploited by it. They think it looks terrific on their CV. So the question is the one that Amelia raises of equity. How can we make sure that people have an equal chance of getting these kinds of internships and so on? It's not one, I don't think, necessarily of payment. It's the ability of all these people to have a chance. Now, what we should be looking at is maybe significant charities, maybe a government fund to fund some of these things in areas where we thought that there was a social value in giving people this kind of assistance.
Well, I mean, listening to David, what do you think?
I mean, I think payment is a central issue. Not being paid locks people out of doing this kind of work. A lot of students, especially working class students, are working alongside their degrees. Even if you're doing a placement for a couple of days, that means you could lose a couple of days' pay. With the kind of jobs a lot of students are in, so precarious, zero-hour contract jobs, you could lose your job as a result of that, as a result of not showing up. I think pay is important. I agree that we need to think about access to these schemes, but they should also be paid. We can have both, right? But we're not asking for much. We're asking for people to be paid for the work they are doing.
Right, but these placements aren't work in that strict sense of the word, are they? If they're part of a university course, then hasn't everybody on that course got equal access, which slightly differentiates it from the sort of scenario that David was talking about, which is where who you know gets you a placement outside of your university?
What kind of work are people doing in the courses? What kind of stuff is being advertised? It's not shadowing someone. It's not sort of, you know, volunteering, getting to know people, getting a feel if you like it. It's doing core office stuff, right? And that should be paid.
Right. So how many courses do you think will close if this goes ahead?
Well, to be honest, I mean, there are courses at QN, there's courses at Liverpool, Salford, Leeds, Hull. So there's quite a lot of universities which would stand to lose their courses, their placement courses if this happens. And I think that will be a really damaging thing, and my students would be very upset because it provides them with a huge opportunity.
What's your view on this?
Well, I don't use interns. I tend to use shorter placements of people who are doing A-levels, who are coming in at 2 weeks at a time, and there is no way they actually contribute to the running of my office. It's purely about helping them get experience at work so that they can then put that on their CVs to help with their UCAS applications or to help them in the future. Most of them, many of them we're in touch with, and many of them have been able to use that experience to go on to benefit.
But where do you find them?
They come from local schools in my constituency.
Okay. All right, thank you very much, Amelia and Tim. England is continuing to see a worrying rise in syphilis and gonorrhea, according to official figures on sexually transmitted infections released this morning. It comes as a BBC investigation reveals that some sexual health clinics are facing closure or reduced hours, with almost half of councils in England planning to cut spending this year. Our reporter Shelley Phelps has been speaking to those on the front line of sexual health, and just to warn you, her film does contain some flashing images.
We're having more sexual partners than previous generations, and online dating apps make it easier to meet people you don't know. Hundreds of thousands of STIs are diagnosed in the UK every year, and experts warn that a decline in condom use is making it harder to treat some infections. So how is that changing the way we approach sexual health?
Do we all practice safe sex? I'd like to say yes, but in the heat of the moment, it's definitely a try.
With a condom, with a Junee, everything in between that, baby. Let me tell you that now.
There's too many STDs going around, so people need to know about protection.
Have you ever had unprotected sex? Like, was it when you met
A BBC investigation shows that funding cuts in England are making it harder for some people to access sexual health services.
Away from the city, we've come to the Norfolk coast to speak to young people about how sexual health provision in more remote areas is changing.
I live in Weybourne and the clinic is in Norwich. It's quite difficult to get to and it's really oversubscribed.
And there can be a lot of stigma around STIs. People are not always happy to admit that they've had one. So can I ask, have you experienced an STI before?
Yeah, so I have had an STI. I can't remember the medical term for it, so I'm going to use the horrible term, which is great. Genital warts, which probably has a much fancier name. And they can be quite difficult to get rid of. And I also think I was really lucky in that when that happened, it was before the funding in my area had been cut. And actually, the service was fantastic, and since it's been moved and the funding's been cut, it's really difficult to access.
The world's first sexual health clinic for men opened here on Soho's Dean Street. Now it's home to Europe's busiest clinic.
So there weren't any appointments unless you've got symptoms, but what they did tell me was you can order one of these kits online and it will get sent to your postal address. So in here we've got swabs, we've got these for taking your own blood. Now, obviously, the advantage of this is that you can just order it from the comfort of your own home. The disadvantages are not everybody wants to prick their own fingers, and some people just want that face-to-face reassurance.
This clinic in South London says it's having to reduce its opening hours because of funding cuts. This doctor says they have to turn away hundreds of patients a month.
We started to see some reductions in some sexually transmitted infections, and that's because of effective sexual health services. But the reality now is that with cuts to the public health budget, local authorities are having to cut the budgets of sexual health services, and it makes it practically impossible to maintain the services as we used to do.
Our investigation shows that almost half of councils are planning to cut sexual health funding this year, with just 24 councils planning to increase it. While most councils said any savings would be made through efficiencies rather than cuts to frontline services, we found that in parts of the country, some sexual health clinics were either facing closure or reducing their opening hours. More and more of us are meeting people we've never met before online. But could this, coupled with funding cuts, create a perfect storm in sexual health?
To speak to a minister, but no one was available. They did tell us, though, that they have a strong record on sexual health and that they've given councils more than £16 billion to help deliver local services. Well, we are joined here, I'm pleased to say, by Liam Beattie, who is the Head of Policy on Relationships and Sex Education at the Terence Higgins Trust. Welcome to the programme. The latest statistics, Liam, on sexually transmitted infections have just come out, as I said earlier. A 20% rise in syphilis, a 22% rise in gonorrhoea. Is this about a reduction in services, or is it about people just not taking enough personal responsibility?
I think it has to be a reduction in services. I think, quite frankly, what we're seeing now is a sexual health crisis across England. What we're seeing is there's a continued increase in STIs. In particular, for chlamydia, testing is actually going down, so less people are actually able to test for chlamydia. And that, coupled with the fact that sexual health clinics aren't able to meet the demands. I know myself, when I've tried to access sexual health clinics here in London, I'm competing with thousands of people every single day to try and get through the doors. So I think that we are seeing a crisis on our hands here.
How worried are you about it?
Well, in my own constituency in Bedfordshire, this has not been an issue that's raised me. But again, we come to London, I'm sure you're trying to access services in London. There is a huge, intense demand in London for all services, not just sexual health services.
But we saw it wasn't just in London. We saw in that film it's in other parts of the country.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are hotspots across the country. But then I think what you need to look at is the individual councils. How are they spending this money? As if the government are given £16 billion, where is it? Why are councils cutting back on what I would see as essential services like sexual health clinics? Where are they diverting the money to, and how are they spending it? And I think a focus needs to be on those councils.
I think that's a fair question. I think that what we're asking national government and local government to do is actually start talking to one another. At the moment, the government's sexual health strategy, it hasn't been updated since 2013. And of course, that in no way reflects the realities of how the NHS provision's done across the country with public health. But crucially, one thing I would like to add is that these statistics yet again show that young people, so between the ages of 16 and 24, are disproportionately affected by new STI infections. At the Terence Higgins Trust, we've been long-standing campaigners for quality relationships and sex education. And the government said they're going to be bringing that in from September next year. And these lessons must crucially inform young people about the realities of STIs so they can make informed decisions, and also so they know where to access local sexual health services.
Right. But, Liam, your organisation used to be a part of this. You used to be very much more proactive in your marketing, your advertising campaigns, along with other charities and organisations as well. I don't know about you, David, but I've actually noticed a kind of decrease in that kind of public information that goes out to people. Is there a reason for that?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to cuts in funding, but we work with Public Health England to raise awareness campaigns. So a big awareness campaign we're running during the summer is around the fact that people living with HIV can't pass on the virus. We also run a lot of campaigns to normalise testing. So this year we launched a self-testing programme, and I know that on the VT just now there was discussions about, is self-testing the future of local sexual health clinics? And I think that it's welcome that local government is looking at more innovative ways for people to access these services, but that cannot come at the expense of people who've got very poor sexual health and crucially want to be accessing these services so they can have face-to-face discussions with the professionals.
Is it just down to a reduction in services? I mean, should councils be bearing the brunt of funding these sorts of services and clinics? I mean, hearing that syphilis and gonorrhea, I mean, these sorts of infections and diseases you associate with the 19th century are back and on the increase. I mean, do you agree it's a crisis?
It's even worse than that, actually, because resistant strains of gonorrhea are increasingly prevalent. So even where you do get gonorrhea and so on, the chances are increasing that you won't actually be able to cure it. This is a very... Sexual health has always been the poor relation of the health system and so on. And it's always been really difficult to get people to talk and be serious. If you were talking about cancer, for for instance, you'd have no difficulty of getting the minister. The ministers would be queuing to come on here. No minister will come in to talk about sexual health, despite the fact that getting publicity for sexual health is actually an essential part of what the government should be attempting to do. Now, there may be a reason for it, but it is, to say the very least, unfortunate. And I don't think it's just the government. I think it's society in general that has to get more serious about the problems of sexual health. I think, to a large extent, people think this is a young person's problem, and once I've passed that age, it's not going to be a problem for me. But actually, there's a sexual health and prevalence problem amongst older people these days as well, middle-aged and even older than that, as people have changed their kind of sexual behaviour. So, whoever's responsibility it is, we need more money for it and we need to discuss it more.
Sounds like you've got a big job on your hands. Liam Beattie, thank you for coming in. Now, cosmetics company Lush was heavily criticised last week over a campaign which aimed to draw attention to the so-called UK spy cops scandal. Lush says it's highlighting how officers have infiltrated the lives, homes and beds of activists in reference to a public inquiry into allegations of wrongdoing by undercover police, which was launched 3 years ago. But critics have accused the campaign of being anti-police. Adverts for the chain include slogans claiming officers were paid to lie and that police have crossed the line. In response, Home Secretary Sajid Javid tweeted, "Never thought I'd see a mainstream British retailer running a public advertising campaign against our hard-working police. This is not a responsible way to make a point." But in a joint letter to The Guardian, 74 victims of undercover police operations and their supporters, including Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell, have come out in support of the campaign. They write, "This is not an attack on police. It serves to help all those in the police service who wish to uphold the highest standards of policing." Well, joining us now is the Green Party peer, Jenny Jones, who also signed that letter to The Guardian. Are you also, as Sajid Javid said, smearing the whole police service by supporting this campaign?
That's completely false branding, and that is definitely not what the campaign is about. The campaign is about supporting people who are undergoing a public inquiry at the moment, but the public inquiry is failing them, and that Lush, that often has social campaigns of all sorts, is merely asking the government to make sure that the inquiry is going to be relevant and will actually work. Right.
I mean, is this responsible for a retailer to carry out this sort of campaign, David?
It's odd. There's no question about it. I mean, I suppose... I don't know how they calculate whether people who don't agree with the tone of their campaign will go into the shop and be counted as if somehow or other they've signed up for the campaign. So there's a kind of element of quiet coercion about it, which is odd. One of the things that's really interesting about this, and there's no doubt that a great wrong was done to people, but one of the things that's interesting about the way in which people think about this is that undercover policing also went into the British National Party, to the National Front, to the far-right organisations, to football hooligans and so on. And this kind of undercover activity was the way in which it was done. But you only ever hear a complaint, if you like, about one aspect of what the undercover police
Because presumably you would have supported...
That's absolutely not true, in fact. They did go undercover to an awful lot of organisations, probably over 1,000. But it's quite different what they did with environmental campaigners and with union people and with people like the Lawrence family, where they actually embedded people for sometimes years. So it wasn't a few months to see what was happening and whether or not this was a dangerous or violent organisation. This was actually about embedding themselves. It wasn't good for the police officers, let alone the campaigns they embedded themselves in.
A small number of police officers and a very large police presence in the UK. If anything looks like a smear, that advert looks like it is a smear, it looks like a smear.
But they were paid to lie, weren't they, those officers?
A very small number of officers and a huge force. You know, I was in Westminster on the day of the Westminster terror attack. I've seen the police working at their best. It's a huge organisation. You cannot smear an entire organisation with that advert on a high street in a popular retail store. It's outrageous, and I would be surprised if any police officers or their families use that story again.
Undercover is lying. I mean, you have to lie to be undercover.
Part of policing.
So the big question here is the how far they went. And the how far they went is ridiculously far too far, and there were some very real casualties of it. So both elements of these, it seems to me, are true.
Right. It is complete nonsense that this is smearing the whole police. That would be a very foolish thing to do, and it's not happening. If you look at it, you can see it's half a police officer in a uniform. Yeah. They were all uniformed officers before they became undercover officers, so that's absolutely accurate. But my concern is that this is actually covering up something much, much bigger, which is the state's use of the police police to stifle dissent. It's happening still in Britain. It's happening with, for example, anti-fracking groups and campaigners of all kinds. So I think it's time that we actually did look a little bit harder at the police and the way that they react to dissent, which is very healthy in a democracy.
Jenny Jones, thank you. Now, the government's flagship Brexit legislation. You thought we weren't going to mention Brexit. The EU withdrawal bill is back in the Commons on Tuesday next week. But MPs will get only 12 hours to consider more than 100 amendments. Let's talk to The Spectator's political editor, James Forsyth. And the government's being criticised for this already, isn't it, James?
Yes, and you've got the Labour Party saying that they might break off kind of the cooperation with the government on the scheduling of government business if they carry on with this.
Right. I mean, in terms of the critical votes for Theresa May, how likely is it that the government will be defeated?
I think the expectation among cabinet ministers is that they might lose 1 or 2 votes, but their hope is that they will lose, that if they lose votes, it will be on the less important votes, so things like the Henry VIII powers, but they won't lose on, I think, probably the biggest single vote is this meaningful vote that would allow the Commons to essentially send the government back to a negotiating table if it didn't like the deal it came back with.
But there is a group of Tory Remain MPs who are minded, I put it no strongly than that, who are minded to vote in favour of those amendments when they come back to the Commons.
Yeah, I think a lot is going to depend on how many Labour MPs are prepared to either vote with the government or abstain. I think if you talk to senior people in the Tory party, that is what their hopes for getting through these votes is resting on.
All right, James Forsyth, thank you very much. Nadine Dorries, can Theresa May survive as Prime Minister and leading the government if she loses the vote on the customs union in the withdrawal bill?
I think that would be very tricky. I think it would be probably her most difficult days as leader, as Prime Minister, but we're not going to lose that vote. Because, as James has just said, there are, I think, over 70% of Labour constituencies will leave constituencies. And this is one issue which constituents are hugely, highly aware of. And I know that many Labour MPs in northern constituencies who are held to account, their feet are being held to the fire by their constituents, who are holding them to account and wanting them to vote with the government. Now, if those...
What about, though, the group of Tory Remain MPs? Antoinette Sambach was on the programme yesterday saying that she wants Theresa May to keep her promise, to keep as many of the benefits as are possible of single market membership and also to deal with the...
We will not be remaining in the single market.
No, I just say just retaining as many of the benefits of single market without remaining in the single market, and the same with the customs union. If MPs like her vote against the government, let's park Labour MPs, how difficult will that be for Theresa May?
It will be very difficult, but, you know, also that the rhetoric has to be very clear. So Antoinette was talking to you about benefits not remaining in the single market. I think we've moved to a new kind of amelioratory position of discussion where I think even the Remainers are accepting it will be impossible. They stood for election. They stood for the general election on a manifesto that we will be leaving in the EU, which meant leaving the customs union and the single market. It would be very difficult for them to come back and to come to the Commons next week and to vote against that. So we are moving to a new level of discussion, and I think this new rhetoric, the nuancing of the words, I think is going to lead to those people that you call the rebels maybe not voting against the Prime Minister, but maybe some of them will abstain. Okay. I think we'll have enough Labour, and can I just say, I think the Prime Minister will win the week next week. I think this will go through, as James says, with 1 or 2 maybe minor considerations. All right. But in the substance of the issue will go through well next week.
How perilous is it for the Prime Minister?
Well, first thing I'm going to say is I doubt whether there is a single Labour constituency in Britain where a majority of Labour voters don't want a customs union. So Labour MPs will be pretty well apprised that whatever Nadine thinks, their own voters by and large want there to be a customs union, and actually almost certainly probably want us in the EEA as well.
Right, but she has got a point, Nadine, hasn't she, about the high level, 60% of Labour constituencies that did vote to leave?
No, that's absolutely true, but some of them highly marginally by very very small majority, and that was 2 years ago, before people knew what on earth this meant. These were, if you remember, these were back in the days when David Davis was telling us how easy the entire process was going to be, and the war would be over by Christmas. I think a lot has changed since the referendum. The one thing that hasn't changed is that that was the result of the referendum. So now all the war has been about how it is, well, you mitigate the malign effects of that vote in June 2016. And I think that's, I would be very surprised if there were a significant number of Labour MPs, any significant number, who were to vote on the government side on that one.
So do you think Theresa May's leadership is hanging in the balance?
No, because they don't have an alternative leader. There isn't an alternative Conservative leader who's somehow going to manage this better. Do we imagine that Michael Gove would find it easier to command a majority in the Commons on this issue than Theresa May would? Who would? Right. Which Tory would?
Well,
is that true?
Well, every party has people in the wings who are waiting, and I think we have people in the wings coming through who are good people. You know,
give me your best
there is
one,
still
then.
Well. So, there is still Boris, but I think Sajid Javid is coming through as somebody who's being taken very seriously as a potential leader. But, you know, we don't want that yet. It isn't going to happen yet. We want to get through it. It's not going to happen for some considerable time. And in that considerable time, we do have some very good people coming through. I think that, you know, next week, I know there's a lot of talk about next week and what's going to happen if it doesn't go through at the end. I think have those talks at the end of next week, because I think this is going to go through well. And I think the Prime Minister is going to come out very strong. And I think she's going to go to the Council at the end of the month with that in the bag. But as you say, if she doesn't, then there's a different conversation that has to be had. But I don't think we're going to get to that place. I think everything's going to be fine.
All right, well, you heard it here first. We're joined now by the Polish MEP, Danuta Hübner. She's a member of the European Parliament's Brexit Steering Group and the chair of the Constitutional Affairs Committee. From where you're sitting, not literally, Danuta, but from your standpoint, how is it looking when you view the debate that is going on here in the UK about the future relationship with the EU?
Of course, one can say it's your debate and it's your decision that you will make through the votes as the Brits, as the British Parliament, but we also hope that you take into account the importance of these decisions for the whole process of negotiating and of being on time with the final decision, and also on linking what you are deciding with your vision of the future, with where you really want to land at the end of the whole process. So we are listening, we are watching. We are also sometimes sorry that there is also for Mrs May not only this difficult negotiation as a task between the UK and EU, but also that there is this very difficult, I think, internal discussion, internal negotiations, which is probably not always helping, if I can say it this way.
Right, and you're making life difficult. You're one of those, Nadine Dorries, with others, making life difficult for Theresa May.
I think I'm making life very easy for Theresa May. I've been very
what
compliant.
Danuta says about the internal discussion has made it much harder for the Prime Minister?
But there are always on every bill there are internal discussions. Obviously there are more
because this is a bill like no other.
Huge, yeah, absolutely massive. Of course, we would not be MPs, we would not be principled people with beliefs if we were not going to have internal discussions in our own parties about the future direction of the government and the country.
But has it damaged the negotiation with the EU?
No, I don't think it is. And, you know, so when the Prime Minister comes to Europe at the end of the month, as I said a moment ago, when we've been through the voting next week, you know, there will be lots of discussions. You will read lots of things in the newspapers. It will all be very fractious. Right. But at the end of next week, when it's all been voted through, you won't be saying that then, because she'll be arriving in Europe with the bill in the bag.
Happy that the time was mentioned, because indeed one of the challenges actually from day one of the negotiations was the time, a very limited time for the whole process of negotiating. And now we all hoped that the European Council at the end of June, at the end of this month, will be this moment of truth when we will really know what is the objective of UK, and it will be clarity also on UK side. Otherwise we might not make it by October. So maybe also this vote will be an important factor in finally clarifying also the future vision of EU-UK relationship. So remember, please, about the time. We have it very limited.
Right. Well, it's imperative.
Yes,
because we need to move on to trade talks. So it's imperative that next week we vote through, because we need now to move on to trade.
And does the EU need to show a bit more flexibility, Danuta, to help that process?
Well, we have to find, I think, a common interest, to identify common interest. And we all talk about the good. You also talk about deep relationship, but then you also have those red lines, which we don't believe are really in the interest of deep, good relationship in the future.
Junee, I'm so sorry to cut in because we've come to the end of the programme. Apologies. I'm sure we'll have you on again very soon. We have an update on our top story. The government has now confirmed that they will press ahead with a third runway for Heathrow, as we were expecting, and also set aside £2.6 billion to help with compensation for people living near the airport. That's it for today. Thanks to both my guests. Bye-bye.